introduction, and thank you for chairing the Women's History Month Committee. To the panelists who spoke this morning, I think some of them may still be here. I thank them for speaking candidly about their careers and their personal experiences. I was fortunate enough to hear some of the remarks as I came in. I'm excited to be at Bergen Community College this afternoon to culminate your month-long series of events in celebration of Women's History Month. March is an opportunity to acknowledge the collective accomplishments of all women. And every single day, women are breaking down barriers, creating new opportunities, and serving as champions for equality and justice. Today's celebration honors women in public service and government, and the timing is perfect because this is an exciting time in our country for women in all three branches of government. In the executive branch, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton leads in the race for the Democratic nomination for president.
Yay!
In the legislative branch, Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, who was the first woman Speaker of the House, is now the minority leader. And in the judicial branch, Supreme Court Justices Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, and Ruth Ginsburg are helping to maintain the Supreme Court's balance of power amidst critical challenges to women's rights. We should all take great comfort and feel great pride in the accomplishments of these leaders and luminaries. But we can't lose sight of the fact that since women represent about 51% of the US population, far more progress is needed if we are to achieve a more perfect union. A cursory review of some current statistics will tell us just how much further we need to go. In the US Congress, women currently hold 104 of the 535 seats, representing under 20%. In the New Jersey legislature, women hold 37 of the 120 seats, representing nearly 31%. In the New Jersey judiciary, women hold 146 of the 418 currently filled state judgeships, representing 35%. And in the Christie administration, 6 of the 23 members of Governor Christie's cabinet are women, representing about 26%. These percentages are far lower when we consider the number of women in leadership positions, and for women of color, the numbers are infinitesimal. For example, in my field, women of color account for about 8% of state judgeships. These statistics beg the question, why do men still vastly outnumber women in leadership positions? And the corollary question, how do we close the gender gap and achieve equity, parity, and inclusivity? In short, how do we form a more perfect union? Now, let me just preface my remarks by saying that my boss is here with me today, and any male bashing or perceived male bashing is not directed at him. All right, critics and pundits alike ascribe different reasons for the gender gap, and they propose many solutions, most of which are institutional and long-term. I would like to share with you this afternoon one possible impediment to gender equality that affects everyone, both positively and negatively, whether you are male or female, and no matter your race. I want you to look around the room for a moment and rest your eyes on someone you don't know. Everyone has to participate. Look around. Rest your eyes on someone you don't know. Now, just for a second, in the blink of an eye, think about an impression that you have of that person based solely on that person's appearance. Now, hold that thought because we're going to come back to that. By a show of hands, how many are familiar with the concept implicit bias? Okay, so I'm preaching to the choir. Implicit bias, also known as unconscious bias, refers to attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments. They're activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. Research shows that the implicit associations we harbor in our subconscious cause us to have feelings and attitudes about other people based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, gender, age, and appearance. Beginning as early as age 6, these associations develop over the course of a lifetime through exposure to direct and indirect messages from our parents, our friends, our family, and the media, just to name a few. People share stereotypes that are pervasive in our culture. This knowledge can foster implicit bias, even if a person doesn't necessarily endorse the cultural stereotype. Fundamental attitudes about ourselves may also underlie implicit racial bias by facilitating a general tendency to prefer members of one's own group over members of other groups. If there was ever a time to recognize the potentially damning effect of implicit bias, it's now, when we are immersed in a national conversation that fuels implicit biases that invariably encompass unfavorable assessments of certain groups. Author Malcolm Gladwell discussed implicit bias in his New York Times bestseller, Blink, which is an incredible book, I recommend it highly, in this way. All of us have implicit biases to some degree. This does not necessarily mean we will act in an inappropriate or discriminatory manner, only that our first blink sends us certain information. Acknowledging and understanding this implicit response and its value and role is critical to informed decision-making and is particularly critical to those whose decisions must embody fairness and justice. While the research concerning implicit bias focuses largely on racial and ethnic biases, implicit bias is also one of the major obstacles hindering equal opportunities for women in the workforce, and I submit to you, in leadership positions. If asked, most of us would say that implicit bias against women in the workplace is wrong and unacceptable. Unfortunately, research shows that treating women and men equally in hiring decisions, job evaluations, and leadership positions is more of an ideal than a reality. We know that implicit bias is pervasive, but how does it manifest itself in the real world? In the workplace, the research shows that unconscious bias is a subconscious preference to work with and engage others who share similar physical, intellectual, or socioeconomic characteristics. One study found that academic scientists who evaluated identical resumes belonging either to John or Jennifer perceived Jennifer as less competent. As a result, they were more likely to hire John. What's more interesting is when asked what starting salary they would offer the two candidates, these scientists proposed a salary that was 13% higher for John than for Jennifer. And even more alarming was that the female scientists showed the same type of bias against Jennifer that the male scientists showed. So if we agree that implicit bias is wrong, why is it still happening? A new study conducted by the research journal Psychology of Women Quarterly suggests that gender stereotypes are just as strong today as they were 30 years ago. Researchers attributed the results of the study to deeply embedded gender stereotypes. We're all familiar with some of the most prevalent gender stereotypes. For example, I'll say the first part and you can finish it. Men become doctors and women become nurses. Men are the breadwinners and women are the caretakers. Boys are good at math and science and girls are good at English. Similarly, words such as emotional, passive, or dependent have been used to describe women, whereas men are commonly characterized as aggressive, competitive, and independent. In fact, I would go so far as to say that women who exhibit these latter characteristics, aggressive, competitive, independent, are oftentimes denigrated rather than celebrated. As an African American woman, I repeatedly experienced and overcame the effects of implicit bias in my life and in my career. A few of some of the more memorable experiences come to mind. After graduating from high school, I attended Essex County College. There are some well-known biases associated with attending a community college, but all of us in this room know that these biases are unfair and largely untrue. With hard work, I overcame those biases and I was accepted into the prestigious Douglas College, a school dedicated to the empowerment of women. And yet, at Douglas, I encountered several classmates whose own implicit biases caused them to limit their own aspirations to marrying a doctor or a lawyer rather than aspiring to become a doctor or a lawyer. After Douglas, I attended Rutgers Law School, but that experience is a conversation for a whole nother day. After law school, I became a Deputy Attorney General in the Criminal Division of the Attorney General's Office. There, I met and dated one of my male work colleagues. We had similar, almost identical educational and professional backgrounds, but I had worked there 2 years longer than he had. So imagine my dismay when I learned that he was hired at a higher salary than I was then making, despite my having been with the office 2 years longer. But my philosophy in life has always been, when you've been treated unfairly, you don't get mad and you don't get even, you get ahead. So ultimately, I married that male colleague, and his higher salary became our higher salary. In my early years at the Attorney General's office, I earned a seat at the power table, the table where high-level policy decisions were made on a daily basis. I soon learned, however, that having a seat at the table did not necessarily equate to having a voice at the table. In fact, I noticed that oftentimes, when I provided input at meetings, my suggestion was dismissed or ignored, until it was repeated by one of my male counterparts, and at that point, it was heralded as a brilliant idea. My response was to drop my voice down a few octaves when I spoke so that I sounded more like a man. Why? Because I don't get mad and I don't get even, I get ahead. In one of my later positions at the Attorney General's office, I counseled and advised county prosecutors, most of whom were men, on how to run their respective offices and how to handle the daily challenges encountered by a county prosecutor. I was commended by the county prosecutors repeatedly, many of whom credited me with running their offices from behind the scenes. This fact notwithstanding, when my director had the opportunity to appoint a member of his staff to fill a vacant county prosecutor position, despite my highly acclaimed expertise, his implicit biases prevented him from envisioning me in that position. Following my philosophy of not getting mad and not getting even, but getting ahead, I ultimately became the first African-American Assistant Attorney General in the history of the New Jersey Division of Criminal Justice, wow, and the first woman to be appointed to the position of Insurance Fraud Prosecutor for the state of New Jersey where I led the office to national and international prominence in fighting insurance fraud. So my advice to those of you who will invariably experience implicit bias at some point in your lives and your careers, don't get mad and don't get even. You get ahead. Chase your dream with steadfast determination, and you will overcome any and all obstacles in your path, including implicit bias. Researcher Howard Ross suggests that implicit bias persists because we believe our decisions are consistent with our conscious beliefs, when in fact, our unconscious beliefs are running the show. Simply put, our implicit bias influences the way we see others, even when we're determined to be fair and objective. Understanding this concept is essential to reducing unwanted disparities in every realm of human life. The good news is that researchers believe that implicit biases are malleable. The implicit associations we have formed can be gradually unlearned and replaced with new mental associations. But the foundation to achieve large-scale change begins with each of us, with each man and woman, making small incremental shifts in our perception of others. To do this, we must commit to unlearn gender stereotypes that deprive women of equal opportunities. So let's go back to the earlier demonstration when I asked you to remember the impressions you formed about someone without knowing anything about that person. Those impressions will determine how much work you have to do on yourself. Some of you may have already done the work. To those of you who have not, I challenge you to unlearn preconceived notions and replace implicit biases with clean slates, clear hearts, and open minds. So that the first blink that Malcolm